It seems like deja vu. 4 years after his first term, Donald Trump officially became the 47th President of the United States. January 20th, 2025 marks the second inauguration of arguably the most unpredictable head of state America has seen. An ocean away in the Middle East, where war, regime change, and power shifts have altered the region forever, a sense of apprehension lingers. President Trump has walked into office with a Gaza ceasefire already in effect, just as he said it would. This has earned him a lot of credibility with both Arabs in America and abroad. But he has also promised to end all conflicts in the region. The question is now, will these promises manifest into action? Outgoing President Joe Biden and his Democratic Party have left the White House with an unfavorable legacy in the eyes of many Arabs around the world, who had pinned their hopes on Mr. Biden taking a more supportive approach of Palestinians, as he said he would in the beginning of his term. But Israel's war in Gaza and Lebanon have left them feeling disappointed and betrayed, to say the least. As a result, many now are choosing to invest their trust and hope in Trump. But there are still many uncertainties when it comes to his policy in the Middle East. Mr. Trump has selected some controversial staff members to work in the region. This includes Steve Witkoff as Middle East envoy and Mike Huckabee as the U.S. ambassador to Israel, both of whom are staunch pro-Israel advocates. He has also chosen Lebanese-American Massad Boulos, his daughter's father-in-law, to be his Middle East advisor, despite concerns about Mr. Boulos's lack of diplomacy experience. That all said, Mr. Trump is known for his transactional approach, and foreign policy decisions may often be aligned with interests that benefit either himself or puts America first. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. This week, we talked to two former U.S. diplomats who served under Trump about what a second presidency will mean for the region, with Syria going through a radical change in governance, Hezbollah weakened in Lebanon, and a fragile truce in Gaza only just beginning. What will President Trump's policies in the Middle East actually look like? The first thing people will do with an incoming president is compare him to his predecessor. I spoke to former U.S. Ambassador Douglas Silliman, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and started the conversation with just this very point. Joe Biden and Donald Trump, some people do describe them as two sides of the same coin, especially when it comes to Middle East-related issues. What do we see them doing perhaps similarly when it comes to foreign policy, and what do we see them doing drastically different when it comes to regional issues here in the Middle East?
President Joe Biden and President-elect Trump approach the Middle East and foreign policy from two completely different directions, even though in many cases they end up at about the same result. Joe Biden is a longtime American politician. He is someone who has come out of the political system. He certainly has traded off different American interests over the course of his presidency and before that in the Senate or as vice president. But I think in general, he has always sought what he evaluated was the larger American interest in the Middle East. For Donald Trump, he comes at it a bit differently. He's got a more mercantilist approach, and he often conflates his own personal interests and desires with American national security and geopolitical interests. So I think that's really the first difference between the two of them. Where you might see similarities in foreign policy, we'll start with U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine, I believe. Joe Biden has, throughout his political career, been a self-declared Zionist, but he has often, actually quite frequently, criticized Israeli policy and tried to direct Israeli policy in the more traditional role of America as a mediator between Israelis and Palestinians. And he has doubled down on the idea that the United States does, in fact, want to see the creation of a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. Donald Trump is also a very strong supporter of Israel and is likely to be a more strong supporter than Biden and question the Israeli leadership less than Joe Biden did. If you think back on Donald Trump's first presidency, he is the one who moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He is the one who recognized Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. He is the one who recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He is sending a very strong supporter of Israel to be the American ambassador on the assumption that he will be confirmed by the Senate. I mean, you will see similarities and differences, but less criticism of Israel from Donald Trump and less attempts to influence the Israeli government than you saw from Joe Biden.
Let's talk about Syria a little bit. The West generally seems to be warming up to this new leadership inside Syria very, very quickly. And then also you have Israel kind of encroaching a little bit further into Syria beyond what it calls its buffer zone. What do you envision Trump doing in Syria? Because what we know about him is that he didn't want US troops in the region.
I can confirm from personal experience that Trump did not, at least 4 years ago, believe that anything that happened in Syria significantly affected American interests. He 3 times as president ordered the withdrawal of all U.S. forces from Syria. The military bureaucracy and Congress stopped that from happening. The situation has changed, however, very significantly, as you described. I think that the United States will continue to be cautious in engaging Ahmed Ashara. They would like to see him transition the Syrian government into a more open and certainly a friendlier, for most Syrians, political system than existed under Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. For Israel, people need to remember that both Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad had kind of a working relationship with a succession of Israeli governments where they did not attack Israeli troops on the Golan Heights. They left the demarcation line as the effective border between the two countries without ever giving up the claim to that territory. The Israelis are concerned that that kind of accommodation of Israel in Damascus might change. And you can see from their military actions as their best way to reduce and delay any potential threat to Israel from Syria. It's interesting now to see the discussions between Syrian Kurds and the government in Damascus about how they might work together and potentially how what the U.S. has supported as the Syrian Democratic Forces might be brought in some way into the Syrian security forces. And for the east of Syria, for Iraq, and perhaps for the Gulf and for Turkey, the issue of the many thousands of former Daesh fighters and tens of thousands of former Daesh family members in Al-Hol and other camps in the east of Syria. What will happen to them if they are released? Will they return to Iraq, to Turkey, to Saudi Arabia, to Kuwait, where they came from, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco? Or is there a need to keep them bottled up in eastern Syria until their fate is resolved? That has been the main reason that the United States has kept forces in Syria, to support Syrian Kurds and to try to make sure that all of those potential Daesh fighters who are imprisoned or in camps in Syria are unable to again have another military campaign against Iraq, against Syria, against Turkey, or any other country in the region.
There's a 60-day truce that is about to expire. It's a U.S. brokered ceasefire truce between Israel and Hezbollah. There are talks about an extension for another 30 days. Do you think that there is something that Donald Trump might do or undo even in his first month in office if that ceasefire is extended?
I don't think that Donald Trump will immediately change anything that the Biden administration has done in Lebanon. All that said, I think that the Biden administration policy, and I think one that the Trump administration will adopt, probably not actively but passively, is to try to find out ways that they can weaken the political and military strength of Hezbollah in Lebanon now that ties with Iran are almost certainly going to be significantly less. I think that that's probably where the Trump administration will want to go. I don't see Lebanon as being a priority for the Trump administration, and I do not see the Trump administration constraining Israel in Lebanon, where Israel believes they must make targeted, pinpoint military operations to prevent the resurgence of Hezbollah as a military force that threatens Israel.
The kind of dynamic between when Trump was president 4 years ago and the dynamic in the Middle East now is quite different with regards to a few things. We have Hezbollah weakened. We have Iran seeming to be distancing itself from its own proxies in the region and wanting to rebrand itself as a state actor, a friendly state actor that is trying to earn the trust of its Gulf neighbors. Do you envision an improved relationship with Iran? Maybe not directly, but even indirectly under Trump, or is he just going to be as hawkish as he was before against Iran?
I'm anticipating that on the first day of his presidency, he will take actions that will again attempt to reimpose what he called in his last administration maximum pressure on Iran. I think at the beginning, they'll probably even be worse than some of the things that he did in 2017 when he first became president the first time. And I think that Donald Trump, more than anything else as president, wants to be seen as the president who is able to negotiate big geopolitical and geoeconomic deals. Since it was Barack Obama who negotiated the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, he didn't really want to live with that. It wasn't his deal. So he says, I'll get a better deal. I think his strategy on Iran, at least in the first instance, is going to be to put more pressure on Iran as much as the United States can, bring in sort of third-party sanctions, as he did before, to try to again shut down the flow of oil and the flow of money and hard currency into the regime in Tehran. It is possible that Trump will want to negotiate a new nuclear deal. It is likely that Trump will want to negotiate a deal that reduces or eliminates support from Iran for proxy militias in the Gulf and elsewhere in the Middle East. And now I'll go to the Gulf. It's been clear over the past 3 or 4 years that Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, always Doha, because they've had the shared gas field, pretty much all the governments in the Gulf have decided that confrontation with Tehran can be dangerous. The development plans, the ideas, the way that Gulf governments want to develop their societies and their economies are dependent upon calm and stability in the region. And Iran is at the moment the biggest risk to that calm and stability. So I anticipate that the Gulf will want to continue strengthening security relationships with the United States and Europe and outside partners that can help them defend against a potential future Iranian threat. But I think in the back of President-elect Trump's mind is the possibility of reshaping the region in a positive way by having an American-Iranian deal that would integrate Iran better into the region and reduce the threat, certainly to the United States and Israel, but also to our Gulf partners.
What about Iraq, which we're not hearing much about in the news, besides some groups firing drones towards Israel? How do you see Iraq playing into a Middle East under Trump?
Trump has in the past seen Iraq as essentially an extension of Iran, except when he doesn't. What I am hearing from Iraq now is that among Shia political parties, the people who are associated with the Iranian-supported militias or directly work for the Quds Force, they're wondering what's going to happen to them. They're feeling a little bit betrayed. They're very concerned. They're looking at what happened to Hezbollah. They're looking at what happened to Hamas and how Iran not only didn't provide additional support, but appears to have withdrawn most of its Quds Force and military personnel from Syria that had been supplying both Bashar al-Assad and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iraq will be going through some political imbalance. There are some who will miss the kind of support that they've gotten from Iran in the past, but the two countries are still very tied economically, and Iran extracts a lot more benefits from the Iraqi economy than Iraq does from Iran. I'm hoping that there are courageous Iraqis who will realize that, and frankly, Prime Minister Soudani and his Ministry of Energy and Electricity Ministry as well seem to be trying to reduce their dependence on purchases of Iranian gas and purchases of Iranian electricity. So I think that you may see in slow motion in Iraq the kind of moving away from Tehran that you've seen in Lebanon. That doesn't necessarily mean Iraq will be a happy, stable place. It'll mean that other factions and other political voices may try to become more ascendant in the process.
Internally, government employees will also be going through a drastic transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, some of them already having worked with both of them. One of those people is Hala Rarit, a long-serving American diplomat who resigned from her State Department post last year over the U.S.'s policy in Gaza. She joins me to share her insights on what can be expected from President Trump in the Middle East this time around. Hala, last time we spoke, the Biden administration had given Israel a 30-day ultimatum to improve humanitarian aid in Gaza or risk losing some support militarily from the U.S. At the time, you called it a publicity stunt just to win favors with the Democratic voter base in time for the elections. And they ended up losing. And now, obviously, Trump is taking over. Do you anticipate that he's going to be more firm with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu than Biden was?
First, I'll say it's terrible that I was proven right. I wish I was proven wrong. Israel continued to violate the terms set out by the State Department. Unfortunately, it was a PR stunt that did not even help them because, as you noted, Trump ended up winning the election despite it all. To answer your question in terms of President Trump, he's already been a lot more firm in rhetoric, right? But again, we need to see action. If it again is strictly just talk without some type of true diplomatic leverage, for example, blocking arms shipments to Israel, then it's not going to amount to anything. Now, the question is, what is happening behind closed doors? Because it is clear to us that the Biden administration never truly threatened the Netanyahu government with an arms block, right? That's evident. And Netanyahu took it for granted that the arms will continue to flow. Now, we don't know what the Trump administration is doing behind closed doors.
Will the Gaza ceasefire actually be viewed as a Trump victory, as reporters asked Mr. Biden when he announced the ceasefire? And to those people who are still in your shoes or have had the same views as you did over Biden's policy in Gaza, do you think that a ceasefire is going to be enough, or do you think there will remain a call for accountability?
The reality is that Blinken and Biden have been saying it for months, and even if they did the groundwork for it, even if they did all of the various negotiations, they're still going to look like failures because they literally made it wait until the very last week. And again, Trump coming in and saying what he's saying in such a firm and assertive way has convinced, I think, not just the American people, but the global community that this is actually happening because Trump is coming and he's not going to take no for an answer. Whereas Netanyahu was able to embarrassingly bulldoze over Biden and Blinken over and over and over again to the point where it was an insult and it was embarrassing. And whether it's true or not, it's all about perception, right? So the perception is going to be, without a doubt, that Trump is the one who ensured that this would happen before the inauguration. Of course, for the 70,000 or even more Palestinians who have been killed, it's absolutely devastating. For the hostages that have remained in captivity for over a year and a half, it's absolutely devastating. And this could have all been avoided with true and sincere diplomacy, as opposed to a strategy which focused on arms sales. It was a military strategy that absolutely failed everyone. Palestinians, obviously, Israeli families of hostages, and the American people, the taxpayers who had to fund this genocide.
What kind of relationship do you think Trump and Netanyahu will have going forward? Speaking beyond the ceasefire.
They're both very shrewd negotiators. They're both very dominant personalities. And perhaps that way, they will either very much get along or very much clash. And time will tell in terms of what we're going to see. I think Netanyahu knows exactly who he's dealing with in terms of a personality with Trump, and he's going to amend his negotiating skills based on that. I think it's also very much based on who's around Trump, right? I mean, he's chosen a U.S. ambassador to Israel that is very, very extremist. Mike Huckabee, he doesn't even recognize Palestinians exist. He said there's no such thing as Palestinians. So if he has people like this whispering in his ears, then I think he's going to let Netanyahu keep doing what he's doing.
After Hezbollah became weak in Lebanon, we saw Bashar al-Assad fall in Syria and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham taking control over there now. What do you expect Trump's policy will be towards Syria, especially given the number of U.S. troops still stationed there?
So, for one, he publicly stated that this was a Turkish initiative in terms of the changes within Syria. And then he, the way he speaks, saying that Erdogan is his friend and he's a good guy and all of that. So I think it's very interesting, right? From a geostrategic perspective, from a political perspective, it's all very fascinating. Tulsi Gabbard, who has, who she went and she met with Assad, he's picked some very interesting and sometimes not conventional personalities to surround himself with. And she very much advocated against regime change, against endless wars. I think he's going to be non-interventionist. I mean, we still have troops in Syria. We still have an anti-Daesh presence there. So I think he's going to be involved because the United States is involved, and it's a strategic importance. And there's obviously the Israel component that is the elephant in the room when it comes to Syria. But if we're following the rhetoric of the folks that he's surrounded himself with, I think it will be a non-interventionist and working with others like Turkey to see how Syria plays out.
A non-interventionist approach might hold for Syria and even perhaps for Israel. But when it comes to the Houthi attacks specifically, do you see the US pulling out from this coalition given how big their threat is to maritime security and trade?
That's a bit unpredictable, to be quite honest. I mean, generally speaking, Trump is not a fan of multilateral groups, of multilateral agreements, right? He's very much of a unilateral type of president in terms of his philosophy. And it's not just specific to this, it's just generally speaking, even when it comes to environmental issues, he's all about unilateralism versus multilateralism. I think they're going to assess how effective this coalition has been and what the United States is getting out of it. I think that's always how Trump sees things. Are we putting in more than others are putting in? Is it effective? Is it not effective? And is there another way that we can do this unilaterally?
The kind of plot twist, I guess you could call it, is that Trump might find himself in a position where he is very well liked by many Arab Americans who thought of themselves as Democrats. If he does bring about or take credit for ending conflicts in the Middle East, as he says, could we actually see him gaining a much bigger popularity among this demographic, you think?
I mean, it is definitely a plot twist. And I think it helped him win in critical states like Michigan. He's the first presidential candidate that ever set foot in Dearborn. And considering how critical Michigan was to this election, the reality that Kamala Harris didn't step foot in Arab America, it's just insane because they knew that they were going to lose those votes to Jill Stein. But Trump swooped in there at the very last minute, made promises, shook hands, held some babies, and he got the votes from Jill Stein, right? Fundamentally, people want to believe that a president will work on their behalf. People want to believe that a president will fight for them. And I think he's going to continue to bank on it. He very heavily courted the Muslim vote. Who would have thought? But I will say that this is a huge failing of the Democratic Party. And I have to give credit where credit is due. The Trump campaign ran a brilliant campaign when it comes to actually trying to secure votes and court new voters. They really did. And the Democratic Party did the absolute opposite. They alienated Arab American voters. They insulted them. They didn't let a Palestinian American speaker come on stage after they held a sit-in. They ignored them as if they're not even worth meeting with. It was absolutely disgraceful, and it's the world upside down when you see the Republicans are actually doing the absolute opposite. So time will tell in terms of what happens when he's actually in power.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. Follow our reporting on the inauguration and even more analysis on the Trump presidency on thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you so much for listening.